Dean Byrne. Thank you to the Office of Student Affairs for this opportunity. Thanks everybody for being here. You could be anywhere in the world right now. I'm sure you're all over the world. So I appreciate you coming to share this hour with me. Can I get a quick sense of the room? Are there, maybe with your reaction buttons or something, or if you want to turn your videos, like how many people here are first years? Brand new to SIPA. I see some hands going up. I see some clapping. I'm flipping through. Okay. Looks like it's the minority. Okay. Have people, do we have any Wrangle or Pickering fellows in attendance? I see Jada's hand go up. Flipping through. I see another Jasmine. I see that. Cool. That's awesome. Any former State Department interns or people who've otherwise like been involved with the State Department, a contractor, maybe you were a civil servant for a little bit. I'm getting nothing. All right, maybe I missed you, but okay, cool. Oh, I saw one thumb go up. Yoon, awesome. So looks like there's a varying level of familiarity with the State Department, with the Foreign Service. This presentation should be pretty accessible to anybody interested in public service, whether you're American or otherwise, but it'll be most interesting for people who are Americans looking to work for the State Department as diplomats. Before I dive into the meat of my presentation, I'll also issue a quick disclaimer. All of these views I'm going to offer are my own. They're not those of SIPA. They're not those of the university or obviously of the State Department. I also want to say quickly, like all of you, I'm broadcasting live from my apartment. And so please excuse any interruptions from either of my two dogs, my two children, my neighbors in 3 dimensions. They're probably setting things on fire behind my virtual background. So apologies in advance if there are interruptions. So let's dive into it. You guys can see my slides, right? Thumbs up or a verbal yes.
Yes, we can see them.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. So who knows where this is? Who knows what this is? I'll kick off with that. You can put it in the chat box. You can just turn off your mic. Does anyone know, has anyone been to this place that is depicted here? Probably not. It looks like a supermax prison. So, oh, sorry, but someone's about to say something.
I was just going to say, it looks like a U.S. embassy of some sort.
There you go, Daniel. You win a gold star. It looks like a supermax prison, but yes, in fact, this is a U.S. consulate, and this is a U.S. consulate in Ciudad Juarez. It looks more like a prison than like a symbol of America's goodwill and friendship to the world, right? And in fact, this consulate was my first posting in the Foreign Service as a consular officer, grinding through hundreds of visa interviews every single day. And I was living then in what was then the most violent city in the world, Ciudad Juarez. I think they had thousands of homicides a year. This was 2011 that I got there. These visa applicants were grandmothers. They want to meet their newborn grandkids in Chicago. These are tourists. These are students getting ready to attend elite universities like Columbia. They're also aspiring immigrants, spouses, children, parents of American citizens who had waited years and paid tens of thousands of dollars to get a green card. In June 2012, about a little over a year into my first tour, I interviewed one aspiring immigrant. His name was Brian Rayo. He was 13 years old, and he was a dreamer. He was born in Mexico. He was brought into the United States as a young child with barely any recollection of how that happened. And in fact, his American citizen grandfather, who became his adoptive parent, sponsored him for an immigrant visa. And Brian was your typical like shy, disaffected teenager. He spoke to me in one-word sentences during our interview. He was ready just to get this thing done, get his visa, get out of Juarez, and go back to summer break with his friends in California. So I interviewed Brian. We had a 10-minute back and forth. I interviewed his grandfather. And at the end of these interviews, you have to inform them of your decision, right? And so I said to Brian, I'm sorry, your visa is denied. You are permanently inadmissible to the United States for having falsely claimed US citizenship. Now, Brian, this skinny teenager, was standing there in shock. His grandfather, I remember, was standing behind him, kind of with his shoulders, with his hands on Brian's narrow shoulders, like just really expectantly excited about this outcome. So Brian kind of stuttered through a translation for his grandfather. His grandfather then began to plead with me for another chance, for something, for second hearings, to talk to him about anything. I listened. I explained US immigration law. and then I summoned a guard to help them get their stuff and leave the consulate. So the Immigration and Nationality Act, under Section 212A, 6C2, prescribes a lifetime ban on admission for any alien who has falsely represented himself or herself to be a citizen of the United States for any purpose or benefit. Brian apparently made a false claim at 5 years old. His fingerprints, which I verified before our interview, triggered a hit in our visa processing software, which indicated he had an encounter at some point in his life with US law enforcement. This 13-year-old had a hit, which is very uncommon. During my discussion with him, he did have a recollection that when he was a kid, he was on some bus, he got off a bus, he remembers waiting in line with lots of lights, and then as he walked past a border officer, he remembers raising his hand and saying US citizen. That border officer apparently had plucked 5-year-old Brian from that line and fingerprinted him and entered this record in our system. Now, later on, Brian successfully entered somehow. And in the 8 years after that, his parents passed away and his grandparents had adopted him. And they supported him through elementary, middle school in California. And just weeks before his interview with me, Brian's grandfather told him all they needed to do was take a quick trip back to Mexico to arreglar papeles, to get some documents in order before he would start high school in September. And my decision after a 15-minute discussion changed all of that. Now, at 13 years old, Brian was barred from legally returning to the only home he had ever known. America's immigration laws aren't just inhumane, they're incoherent. They treat a false claim to citizenship as if it were as grave a transgression as murder or trafficking narcotics. They reflect our foundational racism as much as our aspirations of plurality. But my presentation today isn't about our broken immigration system. It's about 3 things. First, how did I end up seated in that window as a consular officer, making very consequential decisions about other people's lives on behalf of the people of the United States of America? So first, I'll talk about why I became a diplomat and why you should consider it too. Next, I want to talk about why I quit after almost 10 years via op-ed in the Washington Post. So before you go through the exams, the essays, the interviews, and the whole security clearance, I want to tell you about the real constraints, the real limits this career places on you. Finally, I'll wind down the presentation with a discussion of, for those of you who are still set on becoming ambassador one day or undersecretary one day, I want to talk about how to make the most of the really amazing resources and opportunities at SIPA to set yourself up for success in public service. Any quick questions? I'll quickly probe like the chat box. Feel free to just unmute yourself. I'll just move on. All right. So the first reason I joined, why did I join? The first reason I joined was to work on big problems. Big problems. Okay. In the Foreign Service, you're not designing an app to optimize food delivery. You're not consulting some huge multinational on how to squeeze pennies out of every single customer in the world. You're working on these huge problems. So in my first story, I already mentioned as a consular officer in Juarez, I was working on immigration, which is is at the top of the agenda, at least in the American context. I was making life-changing visa decisions. I was screening potential tourists and applicants for criminal histories, for gang membership, for potential ties to terrorist organizations. In my second tour, that's that picture in the middle, I worked on energy security. I was in Lisbon, Portugal, and I got there in 2014. And in that year, Russia had annexed Crimea, and they're fomenting paramilitary groups and unrest in the region. And Europe was kind of torn. A lot of countries in Western Europe had no deep economic ties with Russia, and they were quick to call out kind of Russian aggression. But countries like Germany were more hesitant because they had literally direct pipelines of gas that powered their economies coming from Gazprom. So in Portugal, I was able to work with the Portuguese government, work with the Department of Energy to secure the first US LNG shipment to Europe ever. And it arrived at the Sines port on the western coast of Portugal. And it was a symbol of transatlantic cooperation, but it also put real pressure on the Russian economy and on Gazprom. That was my second tour. I also worked in my second tour on pandemic response. In 2014 was the West African Ebola outbreak. If you'll remember, there was this actually a pretty clean story, a straight line from American leadership to international mobilization, all to respond to a crisis that at the time was really remote and isolated to a region that had no immediate economic or geopolitical importance to us. If you'll remember, President Obama gave a speech at the CDC in the United States on September 16, 2014, which committed the United States to lead an international response to the Ebola crisis. The UN, a few days later, launched the UN mission for emergency Ebola response. And literally the next day, I received instructions in Lisbon via cable to press my host government, the Portuguese government, to contribute the maximum resources possible to fight against Ebola. And every other US diplomat in the world received that same cable saying, wherever you are in the world, whatever embassy, consulate, whatever outpost you're in, go to your host government and demand they do something about this crisis in West Africa. In the case of Portugal, they were ultimately able to contribute a mobile laboratory, a mobile medical kind of rapid response team. And this was in the middle of an IMF rescue program where the government could like barely spare anything for even domestic kind of issues. And the United States for UN MIRS sent, I think ultimately about 3,000 troops worth and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this response. The United Kingdom sent 750 troops. They set up 5 treatment centers. China sent $5 million in medical supplies, 3 medical teams. So this was really an example in my memory, at least, of US leadership, international mobilization to solve a crisis together. On my third tour, I worked on international trade. That's the picture on the right. Canada is America's second largest trading partner after China. It's a big relationship. And because of that, we have a lot of big fights with Canada. And this might be surprising to folks who don't track that relationship that closely, but we have a number of trade disputes, multi-billion-dollar trade disputes with Canada that we mostly keep quiet because we're friends in every other way. But I worked on 2 big, I was the lead kind of officer tracking a dispute over lumber and over wine. While I was in Canada, I was in Vancouver on the West Coast at the US consulate. And so another thing I did there was actually track strategic competition in the region. And that's a euphemism. I was basically watching the moves of what Chinese diplomats were doing in the area, right? The PRC's influence, Confucius Institutes, Chinese Student and Scholar Associations. The consulate in ways open and less open was funding certain organizations, civil society groups. And so interviewing folks on the ground.
Will you put the address in? Because I'm listening to a webinar.
Sorry? I think someone unmuted themselves for a second. While I was there, we're also pressuring the Canadian government to really be really careful about who takes controlling investments in critical infrastructure like 5G. And Huawei obviously has a very large presence in Canada. So again, the main point is in the Foreign Service, almost from day one, you will be working on really big problems, the toughest problems of our time. The second reason I joined is out of a sense of obligation and gratitude toward this country. And this is a picture of me. The white arrow depicts me and my siblings, my mom's there. I like this picture because there's nothing more American than a Carvel ice cream cake and a 40-ounce of Budweiser for your birthday. But anyway, my parents are immigrants from Korea whose first job was as illegal street vendors in Manhattan's Chinatown. You know, they were selling jackets and t-shirts on the sidewalks to tourists. They eventually saved up enough to sign a lease for a retail space in Jackson Heights, Queens. And my mom and dad have basically worked in the same store 6 days a week, like 10 to 12 hours a day for the 35 years since. And while that sounds like a grind for them, America, and that has been their dream come true. My dad was born in Korea, the second son of a poor family of commoner descent right after the Korean War. And he was able to come to this country with nothing, start a business, buy a house, and raise 5 kids. So in 2008, when I saw the son of a Kenyan goat herder become president of the richest, most powerful nation in the world, I saw like a tiny bit of my own story reflected, and I was inspired to serve the America that made my life possible. And so that's really when I decided to become a Foreign Service officer. So why did I quit? Why did I quit? Why did I quit? And it shouldn't be a surprise because there's a spoiler right on the bottom of that screen. So there are a few reasons I quit. The first reason I quit is something I'll call the institution of the State Department. This picture is what diplomacy looked like in the 18th century. This is the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. And in many ways, this is what diplomacy still looks like. I've heard say it's pale, male, and stale. And this isn't just the American diplomatic corps. It's a lot of the European diplomats you work with. A lot of these cloistered rooms where you sit and have these nice dinners. It's a lot of old white men making really important decisions. So if you're looking for America in its wonderful racial, ethnic, gender, class diversity, then you might be better off staying in New York City and working for the ACLU or the UN here. If you want to learn more about this, then see recent op-eds by two other former diplomats. One is Chris Richardson, and the other is Tiana Spears. They're both Black diplomats who wrote about their experience, their challenging experience in the State Department over recent years. Or just look at public statistics on foreign service promotions. This is an open, it's not a secret anymore. People have written about this, they published this, they're debating this now. There's a lot of bureaucracy in the State Department. So if you're someone who likes debating your professor, if you're a contrarian, if you're a tinkerer, if you're curious, you like experimenting, you like suggesting tweaks to processes, then you also might not like the Foreign Service. There really is an institutional culture of risk aversion and hierarchy. There is a long, slow climb to policy influence or systemic change. So for me, at least, it was very stifling and suffocating. And also kind of as part of this, what I call, again, the institution, Foreign Service officers are extremely patriotic, and that's mostly a good thing, right? They're representing us overseas. And there's this belief that, you've probably heard this quote, America is great when America is good, right? I think for a lot of Foreign Service officers that they forget the first part of that line. They just start thinking America is good. And so it's this belief that everything the US government does is right, even when it's unfair, like trade protectionism, even when it's anti-democratic, like propping up dictators in this or that corner of the world, or even when it's destructive, like the drone wars or wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And after a long time reciting talking points and reading White House and press and State Department press releases, I felt myself starting to believe our own messaging, our own propaganda. And so you have to know that as a Foreign Service officer, you're working for this institution. You're working for American interests, not the world's interests. You're protecting American citizens, not citizens of the world. You're promoting American businesses, American exports. You're a missionary for the Church of American Exceptionalism. So be prepared for that. The second big reason I quit after this institution thing is, though you're working on big problems, you're applying somebody else's solutions. So Foreign Service officers are, in fact, unelected bureaucrats. Our actions are constrained by the law, by regulations, we have, the Foreign Affairs Manual. We're an executive agency. The State Department is an executive agency. So the president and his or her designees determine policy. They issue the marching orders. So this can mean that partisan campaign loyalists with almost no foreign policy experience can be injected into positions way above veteran career diplomats. I have one example on the screen. On the left is Mina Chang. I don't know if you guys know about her, but basically Mina Chang with a fake Time magazine cover and some connections in like the GOP donor class, got a job as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. That's a very senior role. And she was put there ahead of 15, 20-year career diplomats. In Canada, when I was there, our ambassador was the wife of a coal magnate and a professional GOP fundraiser from Kentucky. And she's now, in fact, our UN ambassador. So be prepared to, again, have to have patience and accept somebody else's solutions for these big problems. This here was my union's response. This was the American Foreign Service Association's response to my resignation. And this is just really to hammer this point home that being a diplomat means faithfully executing and defending US policies, defending the president. Think of something like, for example, the Muslim ban, right? This is chaotic, it was immoral, it was anti-American. But the president wasn't the one who went into our systems and canceled visas. It was the Department of Homeland Security, it was the Department of State. It was foreign service officers, civil servants who followed orders. You know, in the hours after the issuing of that Muslim ban, the State Department provisionally revoked 60,000 visas all at once. These are for Iranian PhD students, Syrian refugees. This is for Iraqi translators who worked with our embassy at great personal risk to themselves and to their families. This is just a quote, again, to hammer home this point. It's hard, you know, it's a strange feeling. The longer you stay in the State Department, you start absorbing this messaging. And I did kind of feel like I was turning off my brain more and more. And I hated that feeling. You know, overseas, when we're posted overseas, foreign services are never off duty. We're expected to represent the US government 24/7. This is at meetings with government officials, but it's also when you're in the office, it's when you're at dinner with your friends, at PTA meetings, wherever you are in the world. And you can really start to internalize these talking points if you don't somehow manage this, this compartmentalization in your head. And for me, in June 2019, after seeing an image of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez face down in the muddy banks of the Rio Grande, next to his daughter Valeria, drowned. After straining to explain this image, explain my job, explain US policy to my friends, my family, my own son, I just decided I couldn't do it anymore. So a quick trigger warning, I'm about to show two images that might be mildly distressing. One is of a child crying, and the next one is a drawing depicting CIA interrogation. So just a quick warning, if you're uncomfortable with that, just come back to this in about 5 minutes. So, you know, I ask folks on the call today who are really considering this, some of the fellows, the Wrangell fellows, the Pickering fellows who are about to go into this career, could you defend this? Could you explain why family separation and zero tolerance are in America's interests? Could you sit across the table from a Mexican official or a Guatemalan official or a Honduran official and work out an agreement to keep refugees, men, women, and children in desperation far away from American borders? Are you comfortable doing that? Could you explain this? Could you draft talking points justifying the immunity of the US government interrogators who did this? Could you deliver talking points defending the United States to foreign leaders, to journalists, to human rights advocates? Could you give the president, this president, your full and enthusiastic support? If you choose to be a foreign service officer, you must decide how you will strike this balance between career and country and conscience. And I have to recommend, I have to urge you to do so before you invest all of the time and energy into the foreign service application process. Before you start traveling the world and start receiving these talking points and internalizing them, make sure you make this decision, this balance between career, country, and conscience before you get into it. Or you might end up like me, a 35-year-old with 2 kids and a wife and 2 dogs in his first year at grad school. Whatever your decision might be, whether you decide to join the Foreign Service or Amnesty International, SIPA will prepare you well for your future. Okay, it'll definitely prepare you for the Foreign Service. So in my closing to this presentation, I'll talk about what skills to focus on, as well as what knowledge you might want to invest in gaining while you're here to make the most of your time to prepare yourself. So first of all, what skills should you focus on? What you see on the screen, I won't do another quiz, is the long telegram on the left. Now, the long telegram was written by George Kennan at the outset of the Cold War in the 1940s. He was a chargé d'affaires at the embassy in Moscow, and he sent this cable to Washington, offering kind of political, social, cultural analysis of the Soviet Union and advocating a policy of containment. Now, this document, this long telegram, shaped foreign policy for decades to come. George Kennan is kind of a hero. He's kind of famous in US diplomatic circles, right? There are buildings named after him. What I want to tell you all is the days of the long telegram are long gone. To do well in the Foreign Service, you need to learn how to write concisely. You will write a lot. You will write a lot, but you will not write at length. Okay, so there are policy memos, briefing checklists, action memos, cables. For all this, your audience are people who are very busy, who have very little time. And so you really need to practice journalistic writing. You need to put that bottom line way up front. You know, don't bury the lead. Put that main point, you know, as the subject line. Put it as the first sentence. Write short, punchy sentences. Your policy briefs, your memos, all this, 800 to 1,000 words max. If you want to practice at this, the TMAC specialization has a number of courses, including some excellent writing courses that can help you tighten your writing, because they're not looking, nobody in the State Department is going to read a 3,000 word memo that you write, kind of ruminating on our foreign policy with whatever country. Okay, that's just not how information is consumed now. The second skill you should develop after writing is public speaking. So you will be asked all the time to speak publicly on behalf of the U.S. government overseas. For someone like me, I was always the U.S. Embassy speaker on, you know, Asian American Heritage Month, right? So be prepared for that too. You're going to be absolutely going to be a token, right? So you're going to MC Independence Day celebrations. You're going to write speeches for other people like ambassadors, consuls general. So practice. Make sure you use opportunities at SIPA to practice. You can be the next SIPA Speaks presenter. Or you can take the public speaking courses. I just finished I'm winding down a mastering leadership course. Some of these courses just really force you to practice speaking and presenting. Okay, so you need to write well, write briefly. You need to practice your public speaking. And the last thing you need to do, and this is really tough nowadays, is network. Okay, as a foreign service officer, you really, like a journalist, you have a contact list. You have government officials you keep in touch with. You have business leaders you keep in touch with, journalists, academics, dissidents. You need to have the ability to walk into a room and work it, you know, make cold introductions to 36 people in a night. I'm actually a natural introvert, I think. And so it was really exhausting for me. It was really embarrassing to walk up to random people and hold out your hand and have them just not even look at you. But you can fake it till you make it. And obviously this is hard to practice during COVID, but coming to events like this, you know, unmuting yourself, adding your 2 cents, having a conversation, I think that all helps just break down some of that initial fear of just doing it. So those are the three skills I recommend you develop at SIPA: writing concisely, public speaking, and networking. So what substantive knowledge do you need to succeed in the Foreign Service? I recommend paying attention, and I know it sucks for a lot of people, but in your micro and macro courses. The good news is you just have to get the concept. You can forget the calculus, okay? You just have to get the concept. So in micro, for example, you talk about problems of collective action, of asymmetric information, of game theory, strategic thinking. Just understand the concept. You don't have to do the math. You don't have to derive these formulas. Just get the idea. In macro, I think it should be obvious, but economic problems are political problems. You know, unemployment rates, poverty, these drive migration. Energy prices, investment in infrastructure and ports and pipelines, these drive conflicts. Okay, so you do have to understand these economic factors at the macro level that drive a lot of geopolitical conflict. So after micro and macro, I think it's a requirement, but make sure you pay attention in your course on comparative political systems. Obviously, different political systems, different regimes have different decision-making bodies, different veto points. In places where there's an autocracy, it's actually a lot easier to find the right person to talk to, the right decision maker, but it's also a little more fragile, right? I'm thinking of places like Egypt before the Arab Spring, or going back a few decades, Iran before the revolution. In places that are democracies like the United Kingdom, Canada, South Korea, it's actually a lot harder. You know, that you have to spend a lot of time identifying, first of all, the right person in the government to talk to about a certain issue, but also which stakeholders you have to consult with in the broader society, which nonprofits, which citizens, which dissidents, which parties you have to talk to. So it's a lot harder in places like that, but often the solutions you reach there are much more durable. So the bottom line is SIPA will absolutely prepare you well for this career in both the skills and the substantive knowledge. But I do want to hammer home, it can't determine your guiding values for you. you have to do that moral calculus yourself. You know, I don't know what happened to Brian Ryo after I denied his immigrant visa 8 years ago. I closed the gates of America to him. I don't know if he made it back to California, but I really hope he did. I hope he and his grandfather found the best smuggler that they could afford and that he made it back home to California. I hope he applied for DACA. I hope he spent his summers eating In-N-Out burgers with his friends on the beach. I hope he went to prom. I hope he had cheesy graduation photos. And I hope he's, attending Cal or maybe even Columbia right now. I hope he's forgiven me for deferring his dream 8 years ago. And I hope he believes in this country that still doesn't believe in him. And with that, I'll open up to questions. Let me mute. I'm going to check the chat box. Assistant Dean, I don't know if you want to moderate or if I can just take questions from the participant list.
Yeah, I'd say if anybody has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or put your question in the chat box, and I'll be glad to read it out. I'd also just like to take this moment to thank you, Chuck, for being with us as part of the speaker series and for your comments, insights, and thoughts.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll go ahead and pick. I see some hands up, so I'll start with Daniel Murphy, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you again for this presentation. I'm a first year and considering going into the Foreign Service, and this has been extremely helpful and really informative. So thank you for that. So I'm just curious, I guess 2 questions. One, you sort of touched on this, but where do you stand now in terms of like working within a system that you don't completely believe in, that obviously has such important, sway and power in these really key problems throughout the world, and how your balance of your principles versus wanting to make an impact in your career, like where that stands now, and then kind of related to that, I guess, where do you see yourself going now with this new chapter and with your master's at SIPA, and I guess like what is next for you?
That's a fantastic question. So
That's
in terms
okay.
of, no, yeah. So just let me think about that. So the first part was, how do I see myself making a difference in this system that's in many ways seems so broken? And the second kind of transition from that version was, what are my future plans? Like, what do I hope to do at SIPA? Those are questions I ask myself almost every day. But if I'll be completely open, I'm the more I kind of study these issues and the more I'm in a great international human rights law course, for example, some other folks on this call actually, the more I think that a lot of these solutions have to be local, or at least start local. So when I think about something like immigrant rights or immigration, in the absence of comprehensive immigration reform, to resolve the crisis of up to 12 million undocumented immigrants in this country, a lot of cities have filled that void. They've offered public services. They've also offered identification cards. They've done the maximum possible to provide kind of not more than just the basic rights, but also kind of more expansive rights and opportunities for people living in that status. So I've been inspired to see that. New York City is an example that has done that. So when I think about my next moves, I'm very interested in the 2021 New York City election to see who is, and obviously mayoral candidates are popping up every day now, but see what the candidates look like, what their stances are, things like immigrant rights. And yeah, to see what the city council looks like. I want to get involved in campaigns. And maybe, if the right mayor wins or the right city council member wins, I would love to work for city government and work on the same issues that I worked on overseas, whether it's international trade or immigration, but in a very local context. Thanks for that question. Jada, do you want to go next? Or Danielle, I'm sorry. Danielle, do you want to go next?
Hey, Chuck, how are you?
Hey, what's up? How's your piece coming along?
Oh gosh, waiting for the weekend. Well, that was really moving, and I don't want to sound corny, but there were certain points I was like, okay, control the tears. Thank you for sharing that story. It was really powerful. I have 2 questions. I don't know if they're too personal to ask, so please feel free to say no, thank you. But I was just wondering what brought you to exit in such a public way, And were there any repercussions following your exit from the State Department?
That's a really good question. So, so I talked about the two reasons I left. One was like a chronic issue, and that was the institution stuff. Like this bureaucracy is a little suffocating, a little stifling, and again, not very representative of the wonderful diversity of America. And that I'd been thinking about before Trump was in office, right? And that was kind of just lingering in my mind for a while. But then it really was just seeing, the first 3 years of this administration, and with every headline on the United States, starting with the Muslim ban, which is literally the first week after our first days after his inauguration, and then Charlottesville, and then family separation, and then defending like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then like family separation again the following summer, and that all came to like this head, and then I saw this. It really was this horrific image of this man and his daughter drowned in the Rio Grande, and to see that that's where our policies have gotten us. And right around the same time as that, there was another op-ed in the New York Times. I forgot who wrote it. I should find out. But she said she called out a Justice Department lawyer, a civil servant in the Department of Justice, who had defended the government as it was her job before a federal judge, saying, "Oh, these children in these detention centers, they don't need toothbrushes. No, it's fine. That's not squalid. That's they're fed once or twice a day or whatever. Yeah, they're sleeping on concrete, but they're warm. It's all good." And the op-ed was very scathing, saying, "Hey, she is a civil servant. She's nonpartisan. That's all good, but she is a cog in this terrible machine that is hurting a lot of people. And she, for some reason, has become an unthinking cog, not resisting this." And I felt that like directly in my gut, like a punch to my gut. So like, oh shit, like what, is she talking to me too? And I obviously decided that, yeah, she was talking to me too. Like I couldn't be at all involved in this. I didn't want to be just a thoughtless civil servant saying, "Oh, it's just my job. It's just my job." Because it is my job as a Foreign Service officer to faithfully execute whatever the president wants, as long as it's lawful, right? As long as it's a legal order, then I'm supposed to do it. And I couldn't do it anymore. The second question you had was the response from the Foreign Service, the institution, the State Department.
Yeah.
No, so surprisingly, no. So I know that officially, every Foreign Service officer, when you're on the job or after you leave, whether it's amicable terms or you resign, you're supposed to get like published works pre-cleared by the State Department, like their legal office or something. I didn't do any of that. I was so pissed. I was like angry and moved, emotional. I wrote the thing, submitted it. It ran, and there was very little public response from the Foreign Service. And then, yeah, the really not, I wouldn't say disappointing, it was kind of maybe very fitting response I got from my own union, the American Foreign Service Association, was what I posted in a slide, which was, "Hey, good job, Chuck. You did the right thing. If you couldn't do what this president wanted, then you should have quit, and you did." And then otherwise, response from other people, other Foreign Service officers, was mixed. I had a lot of friends. I still have a lot of friends in the Foreign Service, and most called me or emailed me, contacted me, expressing their support. Some said, "I support you, and I'm going to do the same thing. Watch out for my op-ed or watch out for my resignation in the next 6 months." And then some called me and said, "Look, I understand your viewpoint, but I'm staying in because I think I'm doing this little pocket of good. I have a really good program on the ground in this little corner of this country somewhere. Trump hasn't seen it. He doesn't give a damn about it. And I think I'm doing good work." And I understand that too. Jada, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Chuck, for this. I'm a first year, as you know, and also as a Rangel Fellow tracked to the Foreign Service. This was very jarring, but very necessary to hear. And my question kind of comes from what you had initially stated, that a part of the reason why you left was like you were not seeing the institutional change or any movement to combat what was going on politically in the US. And I think that's interesting given that, especially as a Rangel Fellow, and I think I can speak for other Rangel Fellows here on the call, that we are kind of told that we are the generation that is needed to come in to bring the diversity, not only in identity, but in thought, and to ultimately change the institution. But do you feel like when you were there, that was something that was actually happening? Or do you feel that this is the right approach to go about it? Especially because I've spoken to other Rangel former Wrangell Fellows that have been in there for about 5 years and want to leave. And I feel like, is it even giving you an opportunity to actually make change when most people leave before they get to that senior level position to have real ranking and influence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The first thing I'll say is, Wrangell Fellows like you, Jada, and everybody else on the call, you're part of the solution, right? Absolutely, you're that injection of change that the State Department needs. And there have been recent moves since this summer. As recently as this summer, there have been draft legislation sponsored by Karen Bass, a member of Congress, to expand those programs dramatically, and not only expand the entry-level admissions programs, but also allow for mid-level injections of people of color, people from different backgrounds, right? And more women. And so should those things come to pass, I think it would be amazing. As it stands now, I think the Wrangell Fellows and the Pickering Fellows, it's a couple dozen of you, right? And that's in a seat, the year I was hired to the Foreign Service, I think there were like 1,000 or 800 to 1,000 new Foreign Service officers. And so in terms of just the pure numbers, the pacing, it's kind of fighting a current that's really hard to resist. Now, again, those currents might be changing now, which would be really good. But yeah, I mean, some of my best friends, people I stay in touch with, were the fellows, the Wrangell and the Pickering Fellows, and a number of them have left. A few of them have stayed in and are still pissed off and jaded. But they're hoping over a decade, 20 years, 30 years, to end up where Linda Thomas Greenfield did. So I don't know if you're tracking her story, but she was the Director General of the Foreign Service. She had, 30 something years. She's a veteran diplomat. And she rose through the ranks. She fought her way up. And then she left and she came back, or she's been appointed now as UN ambassador. So that's the dream. Are you willing to be a part of that fight on the inside of the State Department for like 30 years? I mean, it's heroic, but it's also tough. Like, I don't know if I could sign up for that. But yeah, that's my maybe unsatisfying answer to you. But again, you're the solution. You're the change that's needed. So you can at least be inspired by that. Elizabeth, do you want to ask your question next?
Sure. Yeah, let me just try to get somewhere where it's not windy.
Yeah, sure. You can
thank
type
you
it
so
too,
much.
as you do. No problem.
It's right there. Thank you so much. So I found it rather ironic what you were saying a little bit ago. So I actually came to SIPA because I felt like local wasn't doing its thing. So I kind of want to discuss that a little bit more. So for me, I was working for New York State government before SIPA because I'd believed in college that local and state level would be where the action would happen. That has absolutely definitely been true in the Trump era. But then we had this landmark climate legislation that it was one of the bills that was assigned to me. I defended a committee and so on. It was a lot of work to get this bill, but then even if New York has zero emissions, that's only 0.5% of the world's emissions. And one of the arguments the Republicans in particular would make against environmental legislation was the competitiveness of elsewhere, be it elsewhere in the United States that doesn't have the stringent environmental requirements, or elsewhere around the world. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about local versus national and international scale solving of these really, really big and important issues that we have going on today. Thank you.
No, thank you for your perspective, having worked with the state government, the New York State government. So one is, I haven't worked yet at the local level in local government. I worked for a community group for about a year before SIPA. So I don't know, maybe I'm stumbling into my next mistake and you'll see another kind of op-ed out of me in 2 years or something. But what I like to think at least is this conceptually, and you can tell me maybe if this is accurate in your view. The federal agencies, federal employees, and even many of our elected officials, members of Congress, senators, they're so far removed from their constituents and the people they serve. There's no feedback loop. There's no interface between me, someone who supposedly served the American public as a foreign service officer, and the actual American public. You know, that was all mitigated and translated through, you know, the people, you know, the president filtered it to the Secretary of State, Secretary of State filtered it all through the bureaucracy of the State Department and came to me in cable. So I had no actual like direct interaction with the people who supposedly I was trying to help out. The one exception is there are consular officers who do like services for Americans, like visit Americans in jail, do passport services. But besides them, there's very little like feedback between me, a public servant, and the actual public. What I hope is true, and maybe you can confirm this, is at the city and the state level, it's a lot harder to escape your constituents. So, you know, Mayor de Blasio, for example, gets yelled at, you know, when he's working out at the gym by New York voters, by New Yorkers, right? He has to face that. Even as the mayor of the biggest city in the country, he has to be interrupted. His day has to be interrupted by some random voter who can yell at him while he's working out. I like that. I like that level of accountability, transparency, and accessibility at the local level. I don't know if it's true at the state level as much because Albany is a bit far. But I feel like that has a built-in correction mechanism and much tighter feedback cycle for working on issues, developing, you know, solutions to issues than kind of working at a federal agency, especially when you're overseas. But yeah, welcome what your reflections on what I just said are, because again, I haven't been there.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, besides my job, so I was a political appointee, so I was allowed to be more involved in politics than, like, I'm sure you were, or, you know, anybody who works for, like, also people who work for New York State government. Sorry about the roosters. That's where I live. But so, yeah, so I found that by getting politically involved, I actually met a lot of my local officials, my former congressman. I'm not even gonna try to count how many times I like met him briefly. I personally didn't go into his office, but I know others who did. So I think it's also, some of it is how, like, and that's what is so unfortunate, isn't it? Because the people who have the time and the money to go out and talking to political officials are those who have more money to spend and more time, and that kind of, you know, but makes it difficult. But in my experience, most of them have been fairly accessible. Yeah, I mean, for state government people, because I was working for state government, my local officials just knew me. So it was very different. But yeah, I mean, depending on what your district you're in, a lot of them have just a few blocks in New York City, especially for the assembly. So when things open back up, go out and meet them, keep an eye out for events. Yeah, and that
Totally,
shouldn't be so hard. But thank you. That was
no, thanks. Good question. Yeah, and thanks for your own experience. Stefan, do you wanna? I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Do you wanna shoot your question out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a bit beyond the U.S. Foreign Service, so feel free if it doesn't work for you, but I guess you know some other diplomats from other countries. And my impression was always that the U.S. Foreign Service in some sense is a bit unique. For example, with the appointment with political appointees, as well as, I guess, the extent to which foreign policy changes from one administration to the other, at least when compared to European foreign services. And I was just wondering whether you also had this impression.
So just speaking in the U.S. context, it's absolutely true. It's something like it's typically around a third of ambassadorships, of U.S. ambassadorships to foreign countries are filled by political appointees. Now, sometimes those appointees are former diplomats themselves. They're skilled. Maybe they're you know, academics who are experts in you know, in Russian history or you know, whatever, and so they're totally qualified. As often, they're just campaign loyalists. They're big money donors, and they're being rewarded with a cushy posting as ambassador to, I don't know, Malta or something, right? And basically they get a beautiful house, they get a staff, they get to have a title. And so I know historically that number has hovered around a third of our ambassadorships. I know under Trump that ballooned to like 40%. And so that is absolutely part of the problem, is that there's this thickening layer of political appointees at the top of not just State Department, but many of our agencies. And again, it's all well and good when those appointees are subject matter experts, they're skilled, maybe they have certain relationships. but it's also terrible because sometimes you'll get someone like Mina Chang, who is completely not qualified, giving marching orders to people who do know what they're talking about. Again, like 20-year career diplomats who've worked in a region on an issue for a very long time. Compared to other nations, I'm actually not sure what the structures are. I know in my experience, I've met much fewer foreign diplomats who are appointees who said, "Oh, I was appointed by this prime minister or this president." Yeah, I think it's only been in very exceptional circumstances where I've seen that happen, or it's like a donor. I think that some of that ties into our maybe among developed countries, like a unique campaign finance system, and how it's just ballooned into these ridiculous proportions where, but it is absolutely a problem. And there have been calls to shrink that layer down. And the Biden administration has actually named a number of former career diplomats to senior roles already, which is a great sign that they want experienced people. They want people who at least know what they're talking about to be in these positions. So I'm watching the clock. We got time for maybe one or two more questions. Daniel, your hand's still up. Do you have a question? Do you have another question?
I had another question. Yeah, sorry.
Sure, go ahead. I don't see anybody. Oh, wait. If it's okay, I'm going to answer a question in the chat.
Totally.
And then I'll get back to you. I'm just going to, although actually there's a private message. Sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. No worries. So you just touched on it a little bit, but I guess, how do you see, if at all, things changing over the next 4 years under Joe Biden? And then I was also just wondering, like, when you were getting ready to, publish this op-ed and leave the State Department, like, what were some of the factors that you were balancing in your head that might have been like pushing you to stay in there? I mean, I think, to be clear, your reasoning was awesome and I totally respect what you did. But were there things that you were thinking like, oof, this is kind of tough to give up, or I'm going to really miss this part of my job or that part?
Sure. So another tough two-pack of questions. The first one is, the next administration. I think a lot of the people has been naming for Secretary of State, for the State Department, but for other agencies, has been very comforting, if not exciting, right? It's like, okay, these are experienced people who have, in many cases, worked a very long time with these agencies or on these issues before. So it won't be chaotic. It'll be a competent government, it'll be competent administration of like our key functions. And that's already a big deal, like compared to the last one, right? Just the chaos of like constant turnover, people who didn't know they're doing in these really senior positions of leadership, right? So yeah, that's been heartening, and that's all I can say right now. Yeah, I haven't been blown away by some of these appointments. Like, oh, this is super exciting, super interesting, super inspirational. But I've been actually absolutely comforted, yeah. In terms of the second question, factors I considered before publishing the op-ed. The truth of the matter is, when you're overseas as a diplomat, you're paid pretty well. You have great federal government benefits. There's a personal finance calculation where I have a family, I have kids, and so my kid, for example, wherever we are in the world, can attend private school. And sometimes our private schools are like $30K a year, $35K a year, and the State Department covers it. There are allowances I can use to kind of offset this expense or that expense of moving. I don't have to pay rent. Like the government either provides me housing, and it's usually pretty good housing, or they will give me a stipend to get housing that is generous. So there's absolutely like financial benefits. There's a pension that's actually great, and so that was one small like part of it. It's like, well, this is actually in terms of a career and the material like compensation. This is a comfortable career. Understanding the risks of like serving in dangerous places, this is actually a pretty comfortable career where I can do interesting work. So it was in many ways tough to give that up. There's also the pride. Like I did derive a huge amount of pride of representing the United States of America. Like I try not to think of myself as like a representative of the U.S. government, of the State Department or the president. I try to think like, oh, I'm America embodied in a person. Maybe the only experience of America somebody might have, somewhere, in Juarez. The average, person working in a maquiladora who meets me in a supermarket. This might be the only time they meet like a government official or like a representative of the U.S. government. So I felt this responsibility and this pride in that representation. That was particularly peaked when I was in, I hate to say when I was in Europe, and I'd go to these stuffy old, these meeting rooms, these big, beautiful chambers and these ancient buildings, for meetings at the foreign ministry or at this Ministry of Health or Ministry of wherever. And one, I think I was pretty young when I joined, so I didn't have that going for me. And then two, I'm obviously present as not a white dude. And so I'd walk into the room and they'd either, assume I was in the wrong place. They'd assume I was a Chinese businessman or something. I'd, walking around the streets and like walking around Lisbon, like people would, I think they would assume I was either a Japanese tourist or a Chinese businessman. And so I liked that shock factor of walking in and saying, hey, no, I'm actually the American diplomat. I'm representing the United States of America. And you're going to sit across the table from me, old white dude, and you're going to talk to me and we're going to negotiate, right? So I felt that very empowering. And, giving that up was also tough. And last point I'll make is it was tough. I think I do call out some of my colleagues who, especially the ones who stay in, in terms of what are they doing? How are they complicit in all this? How are they reconciling, their conscience and their career and all that? And so that was maybe the toughest part, like having to maybe call out some of my friends and people I've worked with. I don't see any more hands up, but one thing I'll do is I have my email on the screen. This is an empty offer. Feel free to email me. We can figure out a time if people want to have a chat over Zoom or maybe a coffee after like the holidays. I'd be happy to talk more. And yeah, I'll let the assistant dean maybe wind us down if he's still on the line.
Yep. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks again to Chuck for all of your insights. We really appreciate it. This is an excellent presentation. With that said, we will we'll end the meeting. And if you want to reach out to Chuck, I think it's a really gracious offer of him to speak with any of you who may be interested in learning more or have your own individual questions. So please take advantage of that. I know that I certainly would. And we'll be back in touch. We'll have another student speaker series event scheduled for the spring semester, and that more information on that will be in the upcoming Office of Student Affairs newsletter. So thanks once again, everybody. Take care and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Chat.
See you guys in class.